Yeah. Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar on security risk assessments. We hope you'll find it informative and as entertaining and as helpful as information security can be. As Carol said, I'm a director at Tecumen, where we work to secure health information, making sure that the right information gets to the right provider at the right time. And as such, we've done risk assessments for a wide range of both providers and payers, and we've seen some very well-done ones, and we've seen some less well-done ones. And we've helped our clients in this area in a number of areas and a number of ways, and think we have a lot to share. In addition to seeing well-done and poorly done risk assessments, we've also seen them used in better and worse ways. That's regardless of whether you're achieving meaningful use or using a risk assessment just to get to that meaningful use checkbox. It's a good thing to do regardless. It can really help your organization in a number of ways, and some of which we'll learn today. One of the important points I'm going to repeat a few times during this presentation is that everyone does risk assessments anyway, both personally, in their personal life and in their professional life. Anytime an organization starts a new system or opens a new office or adds a new application, there is some form of risk assessment behind that, whether it's formal and articulated or not. And anytime any one of us gets on a plane or jaywalks in front of traffic, we're also doing an informal rapid risk assessment. So since everyone does these sorts of things, it behooves us to do them well and do them right and make sure that they're thorough and make sure that they get better over time. So today's agenda, we're going to start out obviously with the compliance requirements. Compliance drives a lot of what we do in healthcare, whether we like it or not. But then we're going to move on to, as I mentioned, the other benefits of the risk assessment beyond merely checking the box on meaningful use and how a risk assessment can actually help your organization. We'll then very briefly address some basic risk concepts before we move into a more detailed discussion of exactly how a risk assessment gets done and what the process is. We'll then go over some of the outputs of a risk assessment and what you do with them and how you manage the risk assessment. And then at the end, we'll take some question and answers. As Carol said, please text them to her and we'll get them all in one fell swoop at the end. We are scheduled for about an hour. I'm not sure we'll need all of that, but hopefully we have an excellent Q&A session and can make this as interactive as a webinar can be. So, getting right to the compliance requirements, the down and dirty nitty-gritty. Meaningful use. There are 15 core measures for meaningful use, and this one up on the screen right now is number 15 that you as a provider or a hospital must attest to. And that is, conduct or review a security risk analysis in accordance with the requirements under 45 CFR 164.308A1 and implement security updates as necessary, and correct identified security deficiencies as part of its risk management process. Now, you will note that there are three elements in that: risk analysis, implement security updates, and correct identified security deficiencies. Just as an aside, first of all, the terms analysis and assessment are used pretty much interchangeably. A risk analysis is a risk assessment and vice versa. Now, we'll unpack that in a little bit, but for those of you who don't know, 45 CFR 164.308 is the HIPAA Security Rule, which we'll go to on our next slide. And that there is our risk analysis. Conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the risk analysis of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information held by the covered entity. Bear with me, many of you probably know this. Some of this information throughout the webinar may be repetitious for some, but we're going to make sure that everyone on this has at least a good foundation of the basics. So if this is something you already know, I ask your patience. We'll go over most terms as they come up with in this webinar, but there are a few we need to start with right away. And one of the first of those is confidentiality. Information is only revealed to authorized users. Any health system that loses a car full of backup tapes or drops a box of records in the street where they're picked up is an example of a breach of confidentiality. Integrity is the property that information has not been modified without authorization, and that is a little trickier to guess. An example of loss of integrity is how a hospital in Los Angeles, who shall remain nameless, misconfigured a CT brain perfusion scanner a few years ago and accidentally overdosed 206 patients with very elevated levels of radiation. That was due to a snafu in the human-computer interface, and the integrity of the information was affected. Last element we need to discuss is availability, and that's the property that information can be accessed when it's needed. And anytime any of us have had a system crash, whether our own home desktop or an office system has gone down, that is a loss of availability, and it does happen, unfortunately, with electronic health record systems, often enough where it's an issue. So those three components, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, are what we call the security triad, and they make up information security as a whole. All right, so the feds are making us do this slide and the previous slide. You achieve meaningful use, you must update security as needed, and you must conduct a security risk assessment. But as I said before, there are many good reasons to care about risk assessments beyond simply the checkbox, and as a matter of fact, they can bring a lot of other benefits to your organization beyond compliance. The most important of which is focus. There's a lot of competing priorities in everyone's day and in every industry, but healthcare, I think, is more affected by competing priorities than many. It's very easy to be driven by urgency or who screams loudest rather than what's important. And a risk assessment helps you focus on what's important and to be proactive instead of reactive. It also gives you the confidence in the information to say, this priority is not as important as this other priority, so we're going to address that next. And focus actually applies in a few areas. Number one, of course, is money. Everyone's CapEx is very limited. Everyone is always asked to do more with less, especially in the security field, which doesn't generate dollars. Especially if you're in security, it's a little bit like flossing. You can get away without it for a while, and there won't be any visible effects until things get really bad. So the temptation for a CFO is always going to be to starve security of resources and focus them on other more revenue-generating areas. When this inevitable belt tightening does happen, having a risk assessment performed helps you focus the few dollars that you do have left on what's important, and helps you make sure that you're cutting the less important priorities. And just for those of you who are curious, that is the new design of the $100 bill, out sometime this year. The next area where focus is important is time. Even more important than money in a lot of cases. Too many of us have calendars that look like this, and actually if you think about it, this guy's pretty lucky. He's not even double booked or much less triple booked, so that's a relatively clean week for many of us in the field. And once again, security, especially at the executive level, often tends to get the short shrift. At Techumen, we've done one project with a very ubiquitous client whose presence is wide enough that everyone on this webinar has interacted with them in the past year somehow. They're very high up on Homeland Security's critical infrastructure protection list. And this very ubiquitous client that handles an awful lot of very important data allows their CISO 2 minutes each year to address the board. 120 seconds that the board is willing to spend paying attention to security. And he needs to make that time count. And again, focus on what's important and less so on what is not important. Closely related to time, of course, is the concept of executive attention. Lots of folks have desks that look exactly like this. And not to beat a dead horse, but security doesn't generate revenue. And we do have a bit of a reputation of being pests and bothering management with problems that they really don't want to spend attention to. No one likes to hear about what could go wrong. Very few do. So if you're talking to an executive whose desk, either physical desk or mental desk, looks like this, it's very easy to get lost in the shuffle. And when you do get those precious, precious moments of attention, you need to make sure they count. Again, to illustrate an example from Techumen's experience, we were on one sales call with a care provider. That's all I'm going to say to protect the guilty. At one point in the conversation, we had mentioned requirements and regulatory mandates. And he sort of waved to his desk, looked an awful lot like that, and said, "Pete, you see that 8-inch stack of paper? That are all the things I have to do. Those are all the things I am required by regulation to do. Why should I put security at the top of that stack? And it's important when that question does get asked that you've done your homework and you know the risks, and you're able to articulate what the important things are with security and why security should be as important as any of his other 600 number one priorities. Lastly, well, another benefit is consistency, isn't that? As I mentioned before, everyone does risk assessments, whether formally or informally, articulate or inarticulated, and documented and quantified or not. But having a system and a methodical process and a consistent approach to doing risk assessments makes sure that you'll have a consistent response to equally grave security risks. There is a temptation sometimes to either throw what money you do have at a problem in hopes it will go away, or to think that all security problems need to be solved by an elaborate technical solution. And often that's overkill. There's no point in using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut if a nutcracker will do. And having a consistent, documented, quantified risk assessment helps you save the sledgehammer for what tasks actually need it, and use the nutcracker on those tasks that don't. I think this photograph should be mandatory for every security presentation ever given. It shows the futility of poorly thought out controls and how resourceful and creative users can be when they want to do something. If you're going to put security measures in place, make sure that they work and monitor how well they're doing. Now, a risk assessment would have touched on 2 points in this particular photograph. It would help you look at the effectiveness of the gate and look at the consequences of people ignoring that gate. It's quite possibly the owner of this particular gate needs to consider taking it down because it doesn't seem to be doing him a whole lot of good. And that's often a very wise and beneficial option for security, to reduce controls that are both useless and burdensome to the end user. It shows that we are reasonable, that we're not just nervous Nellies raising problems and demanding that people's lives be more difficult. It also shows that we're listening to our users, and we know our place in the organization and know that we are there to support the end users, not just put obstacles in their way and make life difficult for them. And the last benefit from a security risk assessment is the additional perspective it gives you on your organization. Often security problems are actually symptoms of larger and more deeply rooted problems, and using security as a lens can often uncover potential improvements beyond merely the security or even the IT department. Problems such as the lack of system ownership, the lack of process ownership, some very outdated or inefficient processes, some overly expensive systems, doing too much in some areas and neglecting others, a lack of priorities or direction for the organization as a whole. All of these are problems that can be turned up by security risk assessments. And in the end, that helps inform IT management so that they can make better decisions on priorities, whether that priority is to retire a particular system, to invest in certain areas. Maybe you're doing things as an organization that you shouldn't be doing at all, and you should consider going with a third party. And a security risk assessment can often highlight those not just problems, but potential opportunities for improvement in your organization. All right. Hopefully at this point, everyone has been sold enough on the idea of a security risk assessment and wants to do it merely beyond the checkbox for meaningful use. And so let's get on to the practical session. Before we do that, however, we'll need to address a few terms. You'll recall from the meaningful use criteria, they mentioned both security risk assessment and security risk management. Now, the technical definition of a risk assessment is the process of identifying the risks to a system's security and determining the likelihood of occurrence and the resulting impact should that risk occur. Risk management is the total process of identifying, controlling, and mitigating or assuming security risk, including a cost-benefit analysis. Now, in layman's terms, risk assessment asks two questions. What potential problems do we face? And two, how bad could they be? Risk management is the process of deciding what to do about them. And I want to make one point here that we'll return to a number of times in this presentation, and that is that the answer to number 3 a lot of times is going to be nothing. Not every risk, by definition, can be eliminated 100%. Not every risk needs to be managed in a particular way. Sometimes you'll have to accept a risk and that there's no good option and we'll simply have to live with it. Sometimes you can transfer a risk to a third party by getting them to do particular IT processing or providing IT services, and that is a lot of the drive actually behind cloud computing, which is that many of the cloud providers can handle security and availability much better than a small shop. And some risks naturally are going to be controlled within your organization as a whole. But that notion of risk assumption that sometimes you can't do anything about a risk is an important one, and hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to it. So the actual definition of risk is likelihood time impact given the controls in place. Now for those of you with a financial background, this looks an awful lot like the formula for expected value, except where we usually hope that expected value is positive, risk is often negative, simply the inverse. And when most people say a high-risk system, they actually mean that this system has a high impact to the organization should something go wrong with it, which is not precisely the definition of risk, which must include both likelihood and impact. Moving on to some particular examples, and I'm going to use a 2x2 matrix for simplicity. An example of a high likelihood, high impact occurrence is user error. It's going to happen. Users make mistakes, and depending on what the user is doing when he or she makes a mistake, it could be very high impact indeed, especially if the user is a trusted insider such as a system administrator and accidentally wipes out the disk of a very vital system, or the user is a clinician and accidentally misenters the blood type. Those are all examples of high risk, high impact occurrences that are very likely to happen given the state of, given the human nature. I was going to say given user nature, but that's not fair. It happens to everyone who is a human. An example of a high impact, low likelihood occurrence is a meteor strike. Yeah, you've got a lot of problems if it does happen, but the odds of it happening are quite literally astronomical. That's not really something that most of us, if any, need to worry about. An example of a low impact, high likelihood occurrence is a virus outbreak. And it will happen eventually given a couple, 3 years of operation. Some exploit will target a zero-day flaw without an available patch, or some antivirus system will have a hiccup and a virus will get through. But in most cases, you simply reformat the machine, restore any data that you need to from backup, and you move on with your life. And an example of a low impact, low likelihood occurrence is a power surge. It very, very rarely happens. In 15 years in the field, I've seen it happen precisely once. And when it does happen, there are UPSs and power supplies in place to make sure that it's the cheap components of your data center, not the expensive components of your data center, that take the brunt of that power surge. So notice how during that entire discussion, we were taking the control environment into place. We mentioned things like antivirus systems and unlimited power, uninterruptible power supplies. That is something you need to do when considering risk. The same occurrence may lead to a very different risk output depending on the control environment that happens. And we will come back to that later when we get into more details. Now, none of the concepts of risk analysis and risk management should be new to anyone in healthcare. There's an awful lot of risks that healthcare organizations manage on a regular basis, things like patient safety risk, litigation risk, financial capacity management risk, PR risk, and performance risk. So none of this should come as a surprise or as a radically new concept to anyone in your organization. And as I mentioned before, every one of us does risk assessment and risk management whenever we jaywalk. We gotta look around, see if a car is approaching, then decide whether we should scoot across, walk across, or wait and find a traffic light. And that's an excellent metaphor, actually, for the next two healthcare risks that I'm going to discuss. So when you jaywalk, as a compliance risk is that you get a ticket. For those of you who can't see, it's $97 in Portland, Oregon, apparently, to jaywalk. Compliance risk is the risk of being caught not obeying the law. It's a periodic check. It's honestly not particularly well enforced, and compared with other risks, it's very easy to comply with the regulation. And if any of you are curious, that is a real picture of a real ticket I found online. And I've also been ticketed for jaywalking, $30 in Palo Alto. So to extend this metaphor, when you jaywalk, the compliance risk is that you get a ticket. Now, the security risk of jaywalking is that you get hit by a car. Whereas compliance is obeying the law, the security risk is the risk that something bad actually happens. It is the risk of not protecting your information adequately. It's protecting some negative outcome from actually happening. Now, in contrast with compliance, security risk is very continuous in that you are always tested as opposed to merely when you are audited. It is very results-driven as opposed to process-driven. And it is quite a challenge for even the top institutions. Some of the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated healthcare organizations have had security problems, and managing security risk is much more difficult than managing compliance risk. While they are related, the two concepts are somewhat distinct, and we need to be clear as to what we're managing. So to get back to our earlier point, we mentioned that the answer to what do we do about a risk may well be nothing. And that introduces the concept of risk assumption, when there are no good options for managing a risk, and you simply have to grin and bear it. Again, by definition, no risk can ever be 100% gotten rid of. Even those risks that can be 99% gotten rid of, or those risks that you've accepted that you're not going to get rid of, not all risks have good ways to manage them. Others have ways to manage them, but maybe beyond the financial or organizational resources of your organization. And others, like that gate in the snow we saw a few slides back, will simply be gotten around. Sometimes we as risk managers must say, yes, there is a risk. We are aware of it. We are aware of its implications. But there's really nothing good we can do about it, and we are going to have to assume that risk. But it's important to know that there is a world of difference between saying we are going to do nothing about this risk at the end of an informed, well-thought-out, well-documented, well-accepted process, and what's known in the field as risk assumption through ignorance. You're doing nothing about this risk, not because you've made a conscious decision to, but because you are unaware of the risk or unaware of the consequences or unaware of the likelihood that it's happening. Assumption through ignorance is probably the most common risk management technique out there in the world today. Unfortunately, it's also one of the worst. This gentleman right here is assuming a very large risk through his ignorance of the actual state of the mountain he's standing on. Some other examples of assumption through ignorance are a wily coyote running off a cliff and not realizing the ground is given out until 10 steps out. Another more tragic one is Captain Smith of the Titanic's assumption of iceberg risk through his ignorance of the possible consequences. All of them assumed risks through ignorance, and it is something you want to avoid doing at any cost. And I've also been the victim of assuming a risk through ignorance. The first time I was hacked many, many years ago was due to the fact that there was an FTP server under my desk that I was unaware of, and that was broken in and used to attack the rest of my infrastructure. So I assumed the risk of an FTP server vulnerability through my ignorance of the fact that we had any FTP servers on the site at all. And as I said, it's unfortunately probably the most common risk management option, but it's the one you want to most avoid. All right, again, I apologize. Some of this may have been repetitious for some people, but I thank you for your forbearance as we got through some of the basics. And now we can move on to some of the more hands-on aspects of actually performing a security risk assessment. Now, the first thing to note is that while the HIPAA Security Rule requires a risk assessment, it actually doesn't define one. Like a lot of regulations these days, it's prescriptive rather than descriptive. However, a risk assessment also helps you determine what is reasonable and appropriate for your environment. If you've ever read the HIPAA Security Rule, they make a big to-do about reasonable and appropriate safeguards. And we determine what is reasonable and what is appropriate through our risk assessment. The best practices and the generally industry-accepted standard for risk assessments are spelled out in NIST Special Publication 800-30, the Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems. It's a very scalable process that doesn't restrict itself to a particular technology environment. We've done risk assessments for 5 physician practices. We've also done risk assessments for huge integrated delivery networks using this same process. It's very scalable. Another virtue of the NIST process is that it's very well recognized. And so that when a regulator or a particular client asks, how are you managing your risks, you can point to this open standard and gain a lot of credibility with the questioner. And that, we feel, is going to be more important in the future, and that credibility in communications with clients. To use an analogy from the financial services industry, Wall Street got its act together on information security not because the SEC or any regulator made them, but because the large exchanges and large financial companies started pressuring their business partners to get their Security Act in line. And we're seeing a similar process beginning to start in healthcare, in that organizations are becoming more security conscious and devoting more resources to security, not due to queries from regulators, but to queries from payers or business partners or third parties that they'd like to do business with, asking about how their security house is in order. So a credible process that can be easily communicated to clients and third parties is going to become more important as time goes on. So under NIST 800-30, there are 9 steps to the risk assessment process. System characterization, threat identification, vulnerability identification, controls analysis, likelihood determination, impact analysis, risk determination, control recommendations, and results documentation. And again, this is a very scalable process depending on the resources available and the time allowed. You can do this at a very detailed level or at a very high level. And while there are tools out there to automate this, we found that Word and Excel are the best options. They're the most flexible. They allow for the most creativity in brainstorming about controls and threats, and they're the simplest to use. A lot of GRC tools are very expensive, and for a lot of healthcare organizations, we feel they're overkill. And it's important to note that while this is an ordered list right here, you start with system characterization and you move on to results documentation, often we find ourselves going back as later steps shed more light or force us to revise some assumptions we made on the earlier steps. So getting into a little more detail, system characterization. Now, the first question is, what do we have out there? And it's important to note that systems include hardware, software, and interfaces to third parties, as well as data in use, in motion, and at rest. And it is also very important as you do your system characterization to look at the users and what they're using it for, because it is very easy to overlook, especially if you let your IT people handle this in a vacuum without validation from the business, how people are actually using some systems. One of our clients had a fact scanning system that inevitably held scribbled notes from physicians on it, which were part of the medical record. And they didn't realize that the docs were using it for this purpose until it actually crashed, and everyone started screaming bloody murder. Another important part of system characterization is defining some legal or contractual requirements around those systems, not just for HIPAA, but for things like processing insurance payments or public health reporting. If there are requirements beyond the user-driven requirements for these systems, then you need to capture that as well in system characterization. Hopefully you've already captured those requirements as part of your disaster recovery planning, but if not, here's another chance for you to do it. Step number 2 is threat identification. And a threat is anything, man-made or natural, that could exploit a vulnerability and damage the security of your information. That can be a hacker, a careless employee, a malicious insider, as well as things like earthquakes or tornadoes or floods. And then it's important to note that threats can be either targeted, deliberately going after your organization. They can be opportunistic, whereas someone sees an opportunity and decides to grab it, or they can be environmental when they don't particularly care about your organization and are just a force of nature, such as a flood. Now, unfortunately, we do need to address the threat from insiders. No one wants to look at their own people as a potential problem, but unfortunately it does happen. I know of 2 cases within the last year where an admissions clerk actually sold some patient information to outside parties. Once he was selling ER admission information to some ambulance chasers so they could contact the patients in hope of getting a lawsuit going. And the other admissions guy actually sold some information to the Russian mob and they ended up with a very large Medicare fraud ring. So, while it's an unpleasant topic to consider, there are enough instances where it happens where it's irresponsible not to consider the threat from insiders. A vulnerability is any flaw or weakness in a system security that could be exercised by one of these threats. And again, it's anything that could be exploited, be that a design flaw, bad implementation, simple bad luck, or sloppiness on the part of a human. And again, this can be done at a very low level and a very granular level of detail, or at a much higher level of detail. A lot of organizations will list every single software vulnerability they have as a separate and individual vulnerability that needs tracking and remediation. And we tend to think that's overkill and doesn't really add a whole lot of value. We actually recommend treating software flaws as a single vulnerability and only distinguishing whether those flaws are in your own homegrown software that you can fix and know yourself, or in some vendor software where you need to wait for a patch. But regardless of at what level you address your vulnerabilities, the important thing is for you to find them before the threat does. The next step is control analysis. And there are three types of controls. Preventative controls that lower the likelihood of a risk occurring, compensating controls that lessen the impact of the risk occurring, or controls that aid in realizing that a risk has occurred, and that is a detective control. Again, recall that risk is likelihood times impact. So if you want to manage that, you can either lower the likelihood or lower the impact. And according to the laws of arithmetic, your risk will magically lower. And too many people tend to get hung up on technology controls as the be-all and end-all of security risk management. Manual checks, 2 levels of authorization, any sort of operational, managerial, or human-based is often very good controls and often the better choice for organizations that might not have as big an IT budget as they'd like. Controls also need to have a very close look given at them for vulnerabilities, as people are apt to take controls and their effectiveness for granted. I bet you the person who put up that gate, whose picture we referenced earlier, thought that gate was a great idea and that no one would ever figure out a way around it. So you need to look at your controls and make sure that they're operating as effectively as you'd like. You need to also be especially wary if a vulnerability has no or only one control about it. That's a potential red flag. The next step is likelihood determination, and it unfortunately is a bit of a guessing game. What we recommend to our clients is that likelihood start out as a qualitative determination, high, medium, low, and then get refined over time with operational data. And you refine it with input from your controls, and you take a look at what attacks you're actually getting, be they firewall logs, AV logs, traffic data, that sort of thing. Another good source of information for likelihood determination is insurance data. That's where you can often get good information on your environmental threats. Or you can network with your peers at similar organizations to see what sort of threats and vulnerabilities they're facing and what sort of impacts and incidents they are facing. And note again that likelihood determination takes place in the context of the controls you have in place. So without an antivirus system in place, the likelihood of a virus threat occurring is much higher than one with a solid antivirus system in place. An important thing here is to have some sort of algorithm to make sure that your high likelihood is the same as my high likelihood, and that my high likelihood estimate this year is going to be the same as my high likelihood estimate next year. You want to make this as consistent across the organization and across time as possible, so you get consistent results. Moving on, impact analysis. Hopefully we've all done this as part of our disaster recovery planning, but if not, here's another chance to get it right. Impact is a factor of system criticality, data criticality, and the sensitivity of the actual data. The very sophisticated organizations or who have put a lot of effort into optimizing their risk management process will actually quantify this in terms of the impact to care, the lost revenue, the cost to fix, or the cost of responding to a data breach, which is currently running about $30 per record. This can be a very contentious step. My disaster is not going to be the same as my colleague's disaster, and if the organization changes over time, we may not feel the same way about its identical incident now as we do a year in the future. Though it's very hard to keep this consistent, it's very important to, again, most people we've seen do a high, medium, low scale, and it's very important to make sure that what goes into that scale is going to come out the same as that scale. My high impact should be the same as your high impact, should be the same as our high impact next year. Once you've gone through all this work, the actual risk determination, again referencing our earlier equation, is somewhat straightforward. It is a factor of likelihood and impact tempered by controls. Again, it's usually done as a high, medium, low scale. We've seen some folks do 4 or 5 levels of risk, which seems to be, to us, splitting hairs. And we've also seen some organizations start using only 2 tiers of risk, high risks that we care about and low risks that we don't. I see that argument. But again, whatever tier you use for measuring your risks, the important thing is to make sure that it's consistent across systems, across the organization, and across time. Similar inputs to the risk analysis process need to generate similar outputs, because otherwise you'll have an uneven level of controls and problems will arise. The next 2 steps are pretty straightforward. Given the risks we face, what more should we be doing about them? And at this point, you just want to brainstorm about just additional controls that you could add. Don't do a cost-benefit analysis from them. That's part of the risk management process, which we'll get to in a few slides. And when in doubt, propose the control and let management turn it down. That's management's job to do that sort of thing, not the risk assessment teams. And they would be doing a disservice to leave out some controls. Lastly, of course, you did write all this work down, right? You need to give your results both internally within the organization and externally to any auditors or regulators or to any third parties who may be interested. Again, we've seen some richer healthcare organizations use a governance risk compliance tool such as Archer or Brinca, but they're very expensive. Excuse me. And often we feel you can get as good or better results using SharePoint and Office documents. So we've stepped through the 9 steps of the risk assessment process, and now some common shortcomings we've found both on the payer and the provider side. The first one is obviously not updating it. You'd be amazed at how many people have a 5-year-old risk analysis out there. Unsurprisingly, things have changed. And often the risk assessment is either doesn't cover a system or is completely useless because the infrastructure has altered so much. Again, not to harp on this, but consistency is important because subjectivity in a risk assessment causes some very subtle and hidden problems. Your high impact is not my high impact, and my high impact today is not going to be the same as my high impact next year. You want to make, where you do have to guess and make estimates, you want them to be as quantitative as possible. Thirdly, don't lock up the IT people in a room and tell them to do this. It's essential for the end users of the systems and the clinicians and the people actually using this information to get involved. The business especially will surprise you with some control ideas if you just ask them how they'd like their information to be protected or how they would solve a particular problem. And lastly, again, not every risk should or can have a technical solution, especially on a limited budget. It's often useful to get creative in ways of controlling your information, and it can be much more useful to an organization on a tight budget. So the outputs are, unsurprisingly, a list of the risks you face with their ranking, a list of additional controls and a plan for their implementation that management produces. Where you decided not to control a risk or to assume a risk, it's important to document that rationale. It's also important to have a plan to monitor the control effectiveness and the threat activity, and that's produce what we call key risk indicators. During this process, it's inevitable that you're going to make some estimates, some guesses, some educated hunches, and where you have a monitoring plan in place, you can get a lot of operational data to further refine those guesses and hunches and to improve the risk management process over time. Lastly, you need some communications to stakeholders about how their risks are being managed. Again, as we mentioned, not just regulators and auditors, but executive management and potential clients or potential business partners are going to take an interest in how their information is being protected. Well, thank you all for your time. 11:46, and we have 14 minutes for Q's and A's, and I hope this was informative, but if not, feel free to ask any questions, and we'll clarify some points.
Well, you did great on the time, so that's wonderful. I actually just sent a chat out to all the participants to go ahead and chat your questions to me, or you can use the Q&A tab. One of the first questions we got was actually maybe a third of the way into your presentation, and so you may have addressed this or not. I'm not quite sure if you did, but the question was, is there a risk assessment out there for MU? We have a HVA for everything else.
Is there a risk assessment out there for meaningful use? Well, to achieve meaningful use, you'll merely have to attest that you've performed a risk assessment. And any party that is covered by HIPAA, that is any party that handles patient and personally identifiable electronic health information, does need to conduct this risk assessment. So while it shouldn't be a new qualification for anyone, the requirement to attest that you have performed it may concentrate a few more minds.
Right.
So there's not a dedicated risk assessment for meaningful use. It's the risk assessment you should have been doing under the HIPAA Security Rule.
Okay. Next question is, how much do we need to look at the operations of our business associates and other third parties that we deal with?
That is, unfortunately, a question for which there isn't a cut and dried answer. And it depends on both the information that that business associate is handling and the level of sophistication that the business associate has demonstrated. And that is why a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of third parties are starting to look around the operations of their business associate. If it's something such as Salesforce or Amazon or a well-regarded, well-respected third party with a lot of resources that isn't necessarily handling any particularly a large quantity or some very vital information, you can trust their own representations. But at a minimum, you should ask them what they're doing. And any answers that come back that don't pass the smell test should perhaps be looked into. And again, you give a higher level of scrutiny towards smaller parties than towards larger ones.
Right, right. How do we go about assessing the integrity risk to our own information?
There's a number of ways to do that. One is look at what errors actually have occurred to notice where the pain points are. Another control around that is additional opportunities for manual review. Some systems that we know of are starting to highlight data entry fields where there's a large potential for medical error. You can rely an awful lot on system checks for things such as backup or data corruption, and it's the integrity caused by users that's much more difficult to assess. Really just look where the pain points are and move on from there.
In the HIPAA, they are required and addressable controls, but it states that the controls must be addressed in a response documented, even if they are not required. Is that correct?
One of the requirements under HIPAA is a rationale for any addressable controls that were not implemented, yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, you want to continue elaborating on that?
If you choose not to do something, that's fine, but you need to show your work.
Right. This is a great question. What are the dates or deadlines for RAs that need to be met for MU?
Well, whenever you do a test to meaningful use, at that point you should have a risk assessment done because you are attesting that you've performed one. Generally speaking, they need to be at least updated and reviewed every year. Again,
so some of that is going to be tied to your attestation.
From 2004 is not going to pass the smell test when CMS comes knocking.
Right. So if you're looking at attestations, say second quarter of this year or something, right? Okay. Yeah. Is there a particular standard that we should be auditing against, like SAS 70? Am I reading that right? SAS 70?
SAS 70 is actually not a control framework. It's a particular type of audit. Long story short, you don't need a SAS 70. My problems and the problem with SAS 70 is that it will tell you if the front door is locked and the lock is working well, but it won't tell you if the side window is wide open. For Auditing standards, the most widespread one is ISO 27002, the International Standards Organization, 27002 list of controls. But again, a risk assessment can tell you whether you should be meeting a particular line item in that or not. And it's a great framework of controls to consider, but it won't necessarily tell you how those controls work or should work in your environment.
Right, right. Okay. Let me see if I got this right. Okay. Do the risk vulnerabilities have to be identified and remediated before the risk assessment is considered complete?
No. As risk assessment, the output of a risk assessment is a list of risks and suggested controls that then go into your risk management process. And again, there are certainly cases where risks need to be assumed. So you don't need to close every risk before the risk assessment is completed. It is enough to say that we have a plan in place to manage these risks, and we are operating on it. Okay.
Next question, can you provide us a sample of a completed risk assessment you have done for a small provider practice using an EHR? We need a starting point.
I certainly can. Might make more sense for the person asked to contact me offline, and we can email directly.
Okay, yeah, and to that person, you'll find Pete's email on the top of the recording that you can watch, or we'll remind you at the end of the Q&A. Oh, actually, it's like 3 or 4 people asked that same question. That's so funny.
Okay.
All right. Does the MU required risk assessment have to pertain to the entire organization, or only the EHR systems that would be used to track MU data?
You must do a risk assessment for all of your personal health information.
Yeah, it's PHI, it's
in the
PHI,
EHR
right.
system or not. Yeah.
Right, right. Next question. I've seen some documents that suggest that the analysis be performed by an outside entity because of liability issues. For instance, if you do the analysis yourself and there is a data breach, you, the organization, in parentheses, are responsible. How important is this?
Well, the organization will be responsible for any breaches regardless of who performs the risk assessment. The safeguards are continuous and need to be operated going forward. So regardless of who performs the risk assessment, the onus is on the organization itself to keep the information secure. There is no requirement that the risk assessment be done by a third party. However, we feel it adds a lot of value for 2 reasons. One, it's very difficult to take a good, honest look at your own organization in the mirror, and it's hard to do that in a dispassionate sense. So it's both more credible internally and externally, and more honest response if you have a disinterested third party performing the risk assessment.
Right, right.
Secondly, a lot of people do perform the risk assessment internally, it's going to be one of the 40 hats they wear, going to be one of the 19 #1 priorities, and it's tempting. The temptation is going to be there to do a quick and high-level job rather than the thorough one that is much more beneficial.
The slide that you showed the executive with the piles of work around them.
Yes, exactly.
Next question. If we use the NIST controls to structure our HIPAA documentation, would that be sufficient to cover all of the HIPAA controls?
No. The HIPAA controls include much more. I think, well, that's 2 ways to answer that depending on in what sense the question was asked. The NIST documents will cover the requirement to perform a security risk analysis. They will not cover the other physical and technical safeguards that the HIPAA Security Rule requires.
Okay.
I believe that was how the question was asked, but if not, feel free to shoot another clarification.
Yeah, I just actually sent all the participants your email address because a number of them were asking. Next question. Let's see here. Whoops, sorry. Are there risk assessment templates available for organizations of different sizes and sophistications? For example, a solo doc versus a 500-bed hospital.
Yes, that's one of the strong points of the NIST 800 series is that it can be scaled to any level of organization. Any size organization is going to face threats, is going to have vulnerabilities, and is going to have controls in place. Obviously, if you're Kaiser, your list of controls is a lot longer than if you're a solo practitioner, but the process is the same.
Okay. Next question is, please repeat the list of controls you mentioned. You can do that, or that of course will be in the recording if the attendee would like to take a look there.
Yeah, there are three categories. There's preventative, mitigating, and detective.
Right.
And for the definition of each, that's on one of the slides. Slide
okay.
20.